So when I was thinking the sermon through last night, I realised it was a bit short of simile and metaphor. So the job of the next 15 minutes is to convince you that, you know that amazing commercial where kids are eating cookies in a way that if you're a parent of a kid, you'd immediately tell them to stop and go to bed, probably. But anyway, the purpose of the next 15 minutes is to convince you that praying is like Oreo cookies. And the aim is to make it a bit more enjoyable and maybe to learn some new ways of eating them. But there's also a bit of a risk to it, which is that this is a first ever electronic service. So I have no paper notes to throw on the floor. I have not left anything on the printer, but there is obviously risk wherever there's electronics. For instance, praying or preaching must be a sermon again or something. So when I first, the Oreo cookies is one more thing, and I'm leaving it till the end. Okay. So when I first learned to learn Oreo cookies was back home in England in a place called Yoxall, where there was a vicar called Reverend Cutter, who's still alive, lived in Winchester Cathedral. He was about 90 then, so I think he's about 130 now, but he was the most lovely vicar you've ever met. He was very, very short-sighted, very scholarly. All of his sermons started off with at least a paragraph or two about the original Greek, and then went on to explain things. And he prepared these pieces of paper for confirmation classes with quite big handwritings. He wrote very big. And I can still, at least I really hope I got it right, otherwise if you watch it on YouTube, he's going to be crossing me. But I'm pretty sure that there was a white piece of paper and it had on it adoration, confession, prayers for other people, prayers for yourself, something like that. And that was how I learned to pray about a few years ago. And the adoration bit, I've always quite enjoyed doing that. That's relatively straightforward for me. Singing songs, music works well, poems work well sometimes. Just kind of generally doing this stuff works well sometimes. Confession, I'm not going to talk too much about confession today. You'll be pleased to hear probably. But the only thing I will say about that is sometimes it's a bit like that time where you go to the slow down. Thank you. It's a bit like that time where you go to the doctors and you say, "Doctor, my knee hurts when I do this," and he says, "Well, don't do it then." There are some obvious responses to confessing things like stop. But where I was going to talk about a bit more today was praying for other people and a little bit about praying for yourself, because does that sequence of things work? Well, it does. It's a really good framework, a really, really good framework. And again, it came to me last night when I was thinking through things that you can actually do it quickly or do it slowly, because my chief complaint about it is that if you do all four of those things properly, and I may be making, as my first boss said, making the perfect the enemy of the very good here, but if you try and do them all really, really properly, it takes probably a good half hour to get through all four. And although, strictly speaking, half an hour is a long time, there's lots of things I do that half an hour flies by. Watching telly, playing squash, walking, running, even driving to and from places. Half an hour of praying can seem like really quite a long time. So a more modest challenge might be, well, what can you do in 5 minutes? So for those of you who watch hockey, I think 5 minutes is a good length of time. The interval between two hockey periods is 17 minutes. So there is time to go and make a cup of tea, turn the telly off, have 5 minutes of praying with some time to spare, and turn back on and watch the rest. And you've got a very obvious prayer if Montreal are losing. So it's a good segment into it. And you miss Don Cherry if you watch it in English, which is even better. So a more modest challenge would be, well, what do you do in 5 minutes? How do you prepare yourself? And what can you do in that 5 minutes? And now, so I'll just give you a list of some of my excuses for why I wouldn't pray, because there's quite a lot of them. Firstly, I am very definitely I'll do that tomorrow sort of person. So the first thing, I don't really feel like it today, I'm not in the right state of mind, it's been a bad day at work, I'm tired, children are bad behaved, the dog wants to play, I'm not going to do it, I'll do it tomorrow. So that's the first excuse, which is a bad one. The second thing, there has to be, I think, the right level of distraction. So clearly the telly being on, a BlackBerry being on, a smartphone being on, the radio being on, music maybe works, but the other things definitely not there. Too much distraction Also, actually, on the other hand, complete and utter silence, I quite like it, but I've also heard quite a few people who don't actually like complete silence. They say it's almost too distracting, having nothing to distract you even a little bit. Some physical things work a bit as well. Walking with the dog works, providing the dog walks and not kind of darts all over the place. Actually doing things like cycling or kayaking can be quite good if you can get in a rhythm of doing things, but it's not too distracting. So there's a level of preparation, and I know some people like to use candles, some people like to do other things. Driving around Montreal, I find not very good. I think there's a bit too much concentrating. Prayers are too often directed to keep me safe for the next 30 seconds rather than more long-term things. However, actually, I must say some of my more helpful times where I have prayed have been driving on long journeys in complete silence where there's nothing on the road and you can just get going and keep going and you can think. Nobody thinks you're mad to talk, but you appear like you're talking to yourself. So that works very, very well. There's actually surprisingly little guidance in the Bible about how to pray as well. If you read through, there really isn't much. There's the Lord's Prayer. There's one or two places where we're told that all of our prayers are answered if we ask in faith. And the bit that does give me some encouragement is that Jesus, when he did pray, quite often seemed to go off into lonely places to pray. So he obviously had the same problems that I think most people have about being distracted, needing time to go and settle himself down for a good long time. So, as I think Michel Terrien has written on the changing room of the Montreal Canadians, the wall of the changing room, this is no excuses. So now we've got all the excuses as to why you don't pray out of the way. The next question is, well, how am I talking and to whom? Because the other thing that I realised after only about 25 years or so is that method of praying that we learn in the Church of England in a very traditional church, the list of vicars goes back to about 1200 and something, and the vicar who taught me could easily have been the vicar in 1200 and something. I think as I say, he was fantastic, but he was definitely of the traditional school. But what that encouraged me to do, I think, is to pray as though it was praying in sessions in church, so you write them quite clearly, you write them very nicely, as well as you can manage it, but they're kind of quite a formal way of praying, quite a formal way of talking. So I have been trying to do some different things recently. And there is a balance that I've been wrestling with a bit, because God is obviously God, and creator of everything, Lord of the universe, etc. And maybe it's wrong to be a bit too familiar with him for that reason. It could be quite scary coming up against God like that. On the other hand, the first two words that Jesus says pray are Our Father, and he also gives lots of similes as to who he is in the Bible. Similes or metaphors, any English teachers can correct me afterwards. He also gives lots of similes or metaphors in the Bible about much more approachable people than that, like a gardener or a shepherd or other people who would not be at all scary to talk to. So more recently I've been praying in a nice garden, a metaphorical, imaginary nice garden, and talking to a gardener, which is quite good, except that I don't find I'm getting many answers. The gardener is quite silent. He's about his business and pruning things and not doing so much in the way of talking back. So then I started asking myself, well, am I optimistic expecting God to just answer me in prayer? I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a conversation as such. And as someone at work says to me, sometimes you need to be careful what you wish for. And then when I was reading up a bit before that, I think there's a more learned quote about that, which is something about the vengeance of gods who actually answer prayer. And definitely, if I think back, I think if God had answered all the prayers I prayed, the world could be quite chaotic. And if I multiply that by, let's say, 1 billion Christians who may be at church today, all of whom are praying in faith and very good and worthy prayers, if they were all answered instantaneously by God, I don't think things would settle down to a sort of regular beat of life. It could be, like I say, quite chaotic. So although I do believe God answers prayers, I don't necessarily think he answers absolutely every prayer or I haven't found he answers every prayer in a way that I would expect it. I also, I have a sneaking suspicion that if I ever get the chance to ask him, And I say, well, you never answered my prayers. And I said, well, hang on, yes I did. I answered all sorts of your prayers, but you never gave me any credit for it when I did. So it's a bit like the supermarket trolley syndrome, you know. Well, if I pray for something and it doesn't happen, well, God never answered that prayer. But if I pray for something, like I pray that, just think of a good example, pray to be patient in a circumstance, that something works out well, or for, I find it easier to pray for behaviours rather than events, if that makes sense. So I find it easier to pray for strength or for patience or for something on those lines than I do to say, do this, because I find the do this bit prescribes too much of an answer to God. Yes, so pray for behaviour, and it does go quite well, and I asked for it to go well, and I asked for patience, and I was patient. I'm not convinced I would give God the credit for that. I was, oh, that's good, I'll go to out pretty well. So I wouldn't be surprised if we all get to heaven and find that there's a bit of a list of things that we prayed for that were answered that maybe we weren't quite grateful enough for. The other thing I do take some comfort from is that although, and I do struggle with this as well, by the way, but although the Bible does say your prayers will be answered in faith, it also says that God will give you really what you need rather than necessarily what you ask for. And also when Jesus was in his most anguished moments in the Garden of Gethsemane and did pray a real prayer to a real God who, we have to assume, I think, that Jesus had faith, when he prayed a real prayer in faith, it wasn't answered. When he asked for not to be crucified, and it wasn't answered. So clearly there's a bit of a good precedent there. And I think although in some ways the universe is predictable, you know, if I push my glasses case, it will move. In other ways, the universe is definitely not predictable. People who found out about chaos theory and statistics and random behaviour would definitely say that it's not just a mechanistic universe. Thoughts have moved on since then. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think God does answer prayers. I found that he does answer some of my prayers. I found that he has not answered some of my prayers, but you have to have some faith that that's okay. And I think when I was thinking this through, I think the biggest thing is that when we do pray, we actually open ourselves up to God and become more vulnerable and honest with him, rather than praying for what we think we ought to be praying for what's really on our mind. I think I found that's when God is prepared to talk to us and prepared to be communicate more with us, rather than when we do what we think we ought to do, or when we have a long list of things. So I think some of it's about being honest with God, because after all, he knows anyway, so you really, really, really might as well be honest with him. And although and again, that's one thing that I've found since I've been a bit less formal, is that when you write formal prayers, you can think, well, what ought I to be doing here? What should be important? Actually, when you pray a bit more informally, what I've found is that I do end up praying more about what's on my mind. But there is a balance to that, which is one of the good things about the Reverend Cutter's list, which is the common list, is that it does give you a framework to make sure you don't forget things. And that's where it's actually quite handy, because sometimes I find you can get quite wrapped up in the same thing over and over again, whereas actually it's good to branch out with it as well. So, this question is some like I said, I've been experimenting a little bit recently, so all the prayers up to that point have all been with words, but actually I've also found it quite helpful to imagine pictures and situations. So imagine the person I'm praying for, just imagine that situation or that person, maybe with, I like that song, The Glory Appears Like the Light from the Sun. Just imagine light on them, imagine God taking them, whatever you want to imagine. I find that's quite good, because sometimes language isn't enough to say either what you mean or what you think, or what you think you mean, if that makes sense. So sometimes it's just about offering things up to God and seeing what he would like to do with it. And in terms of the listening bit, I've also found that sometimes it's quite good to imagine yourself in Bible stories. For some reason I always think of Zacchaeus when I do that. Maybe that was the first time I tried it. I don't know, Zacchaeus who had to climb the tree, he was small. And I've always, when I think of that, I always end up going back to that story. But if you can picture yourself in it, it gives a different perspective. And also, either if you read a chapter of the Bible, then sometimes it's good to just pick one verse and read that over and over again and see what God says to you through that. And that can combine quite nicely with a breathing type prayer where you can say one thing as you breathe in and another thing as you breathe out. So, I'm trying to think of, so for example, Lord Jesus Christ, I pray for my friend whoever it is. And if you keep saying that over and over again, that's quite good. Although I do not recommend doing it at bedtime. I forgot to say that the biggest reason for trying something different with prayer is that although that method is fantastic, I should think the number of times I've used it in the last 25 years is about 5. So there is a bit of a discussion about regular prayer versus frequent prayer. And I think frequent and short is probably better than regular, but once every decade or so. So finally, I think places are good. You know, beaches I find good, hills are good, churches, silent cars, fields. It can be useful also to bring up memories of when it was good to be with God. I've got a good memory when I sat in a field. I was supposed to be chopping docks down to the side, I think, but I was sat in a field and there was just a gentle breeze and the sunshine. It was really, really nice and I felt very close to God. It was a long time ago, but it was good. And it's good to remember that, yeah, you did feel close to God once, especially if you don't at the moment for some reason. However, the trap with that is life moves on and you can't keep going back to places, or I can't keep going back to places where it was good before necessarily. It's kind of a one-way journey. So places are good. The other thing, I've read one book on prayer for this, which is a book by C.S. Lewis called Prayer. In it he says something like, the problem with prayer is that nobody's written a good book on it, but he was smart enough to write one, so if you want to read it, it's pretty good. So there's one, and the other thing that he says in that, which is both encouraging and, I believe it's true, because it's been my experience as well, but it's both encouraging and a bit anguishing, I suppose, is that his view is that as soon as you start to get a picture of God in your mind, and you start to get a way of praying in your mind, or you start to get images of God in your mind, then God will destroy that and make you move on, because he's too big to be contained in a static image. It moves on. So I think I have to conclude that I've been very static for about 25 years or thereabouts. Things are moving a bit more now. I know Daniel was very pleased that I put in a bit from The Hobbit in there, that when you start on a journey, Bilbo Baggins starts on his journey and never knows where he's going to go. You might find a dragon, although you probably won't. If you do find a hoard of treasure, the roof could need fixing. If you find spiritual treasure, that's even better. So my closing book, closing part of the talk, I guess, is experiment. It's not that bad. You can try this at home. It's reasonably safe. The worst that can happen is you'll be eaten by a dragon. The best is that you'll find some spiritual treasure and you'll learn to eat Oreo cookies in a different way. And with that, let's affirm our faith in verse 3 on page 2.